Well, thank you so much, Rianne, and thanks everyone at 21 Acres for being here today to embark on the journey of the tomato with us. And here at Hawthorn Farm, we agree with what you have said in the introduction. We appreciate the opportunity to steward this land to the best of our ability, and have been doing so for about...
Sorry, I'm just going to put it on gallery so we can see all of you.
Yay, great. I've lived here since 2003 and have been just growing more food ever since. I didn't grow up with a big garden or doing a lot of this stuff, and have learned a lot along the way, along with my muse, Daniel here, who loves to eat as well. And so we've had great adventures growing our own food, and we prepared for 6 years so that in 2017, we could spend the entire calendar year eating only hand-harvested food. And that was harvested by us or harvested by friends, but it was a no grocery store year for us. And we ate beautifully. It was so much fun. And a lot of people say, wow, that's so impressive. But I always like to point out that eating that way is actually the historical norm. Like, that is how most humans have eaten throughout history. So it was really refreshing, really engaging to tie into that way of eating. So much so that we've kept eating a lot of that way, except we do get coffee. So yeah, we continue to do our best to eat the sunlight that falls on our land. That's part of the big experiment that we're engaged in. And I say it's like living in a big 4-dimensional crossword puzzle. And of course, our experience in this place is just our experience. You might be at a totally different latitude, a totally different first and last frost date when you're planting your tomatoes. So take all of what I say here with a grain of salt. You may find better ways to do this and great resources, but this is how I have been doing tomato processing for a number of years now. So take it as a jumping off place. My hope is to give you some of the basics, give you some of the principles, and then the enthusiasm and encouragement to go out and experiment with your own tasty tomatoes. So yeah, that's a little bit about where I'm coming from. Anything you want to add, Daniel?
Thanks for coming to join us on these classes. We would love to be doing them in person, and it's actually such an opportunity to get to share from our own home too, and share the stories from where we're living the stories. So if things ever change in terms of in-person interactions, maybe we'll continue an at-home segment and do in-person classes at 21 Acres, because both seem really valuable. To get a tour of our life in place is actually pretty cool. And to get to share that with you is awesome. And I won't be much in this particular month's class in terms of you seeing me, but I will say that I built or directed the building of all the hoop houses that grew all the tomatoes. So that's my part. And I love eating them in all forms. So you're in good hands with Alexia here.
Great. All right. Well, without further ado, I can jump into the story of these tomatoes. And again, I kind of wish I could hear from all of you and see where you are, but I'm going to just tell you the story of what happened here with these tomatoes. And these tomatoes started out as little seeds in February. And this tomato is the baby of one of last year's tomato plants. I save seed from each year's tomato plants. And it's quite easy to do for tomatoes, and it works out quite well. It doesn't work well for all plants. Like, I can't save corn seed from a lot of from the amount of corn plants I can grow, but I can save one tomato, put it in a jar and let it rot a little bit. Actually need to put a label on it so that says, this is not compost. Like, do not feed this to the chickens. I am getting tomato seed from this. And that way I'll have, out of here, 50 more tomato seeds. So that would be, I'll be able to grow 50 more tomato plants that will breed relatively true to type. If I like to eat this tomato, chances are I will like to eat the fruits that grow out of the plants that result from the seeds in here. So that's something really fun about tomatoes, except for, okay, dun, 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 here we have Sun Gold cherry tomatoes. And on the seed packet, this said Sun Gold F1, which means the F1 means that it's a hybrid. So this tasty cherry tomato had one parent that was one kind of tomato and one parent with a different kind of tomato. So if I save seeds out of this tomato, I could get a whole bunch of random looking tomatoes, all probably similar. And in fact, I have done that before. I've saved seed out of these. But for now, I just buy my Sun Gold hybrid tomato seeds and enjoy growing them year to year. I could save them and dehybridize them, but it's just more of a tomato breeding project than I'm willing to take on at this point. Of plant breeding, tomatoes are native to Central America and kind of developed as like big tropical compost pile plants. And they've been transported around the world. There are tomato varieties that people have developed over many years in many different places. Here in Western Washington, in the Pacific Northwest, we are at the edge of happy tomato growing zone. And that really influences the kind of tomatoes I grow. Some varieties will do well here, some varieties will not. And when I'm looking at a seed packet of tomatoes, I want a variety that says 80 days, meaning 80 days to maturity, or less. If it says 74 days, that's an even better bet for actually getting a ripe tomato here. Some people treasure their grandma's, green tomato chutney recipes. Some people love eating green tomatoes. Frankly, not me. I would rather maximize my ripe tomatoes. And in fact, if we plant it right and the fates smile upon us, we're eating ripe tomatoes from the end of June into November. So considering, and I spend a lot of time fussing over the little tomato seedlings, and I start them myself, usually end of February, beginning of March, in a heated compost pile greenhouse. That's a whole other story. But giving them a good start, lots of songs, lots of TLC, and then I plant about 50 tomato plants, and that keeps us well supplied, and in our household of 8, plus a good share of the neighborhood, keeps us well supplied in tomatoes through the year. We're eating tomato cucumber salads like every day, pretty much from July, into October. So our first frost happened in October. I grow all the tomatoes under cover, like in some kind of greenhouse, hoop house style structure. I just have not had tomatoes really survive happily outside of a hoop house. So I grow them in a hoop house, some kind of protection from the weather and from moisture. We have late blight here, a fungal disease that really loves to live on wet leaves. So if I can keep the tomato plants dry, they tend to last multiple weeks more and ripen just that many more tomatoes. So I also need to prune my tomatoes. I just have to tell them, I'm like, honey, you are not in Costa Rica. Like, you are so optimistic that you are putting out flowers in September, but I have to tell you, like, you're just not going to be able to ripen those flowers because there's going to be a frost in October, and that'll be it. So yeah, I really have to prune. I really have to kind of keep the tomatoes putting as much energy as possible into ripening fruits. Like, that's their job. So like I said, I grow about 50 plus tomato plants, and I grow.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it kind of intersects really well with one of the questions we got for any tips on growing tomatoes in an apartment. I was thinking, well, it's dry in there.
Yeah. Great question. Tomatoes love sunshine. Like, they are tropical plants. So if you have 8 hours of direct sun anywhere, you can totally grow a tomato. And you can grow a tomato plant in a container on a deck, you know, or on your front porch. There are 2 main styles of tomato plant that you'll see again on a seed packet when you're out there looking for tomatoes: determinate and indeterminate. And determinate tomatoes will like grow a whole bunch, and they'll put out a bunch of flowers, and they'll put out a bunch of fruit, and that's what they do. They have a whole bunch of fruit at once, in general. Determinate tomatoes just keep growing and just keep flowering and just keep putting out little bits of fruit, you know, now and then. And if you're growing in a container situation, determinates sometimes do better because the leaf mass is mirrored by the root mass. So plants with smaller leafy bits will have smaller root areas typically. But you could keep a well-pruned determinate tomato in a big pot as well. The bigger the pot, the better. Like, too heavy to lift is probably just about big enough. And make sure that you have really awesome soil. Tomatoes need a lot of calcium in their soil. And I don't have any examples of blossom end rot on my tomatoes because I put a lot of extra calcium in the soil. Eggshells is the calcium carbonate. Chalk. I buy ag lime, just a $6 bag of agricultural lime that would last for 50 years of growing tomatoes. Sometimes you'll see the end of the tomato, the blossom end, as opposed to the stem end, get kind of black and mushy. So that's usually a sign of low calcium in the soil. Make sure you've got good calcium, well-balanced soil, and grow tomatoes wherever. They're really amenable. Like, they will try to do their best for us if we plant them and water them. They like consistent water. That's a big thing. If you get the plant really dry and then give it a bunch of water, the fruits will often crack, which I'm like, well, okay, time to make a bunch of tomato sauce right away. You know, like, the fruits will be kind of dry and then they get a bunch of water and they just crack their skins. I'll actually show you that in a moment here when we get into canning. Okay, one more tomato, kind of tomato overview thing. I grow 3 different basic kinds of tomato varieties. Tried and true, I grow cherry tomatoes, lots of cherry tomatoes. These are great. They're so small that they will ripen really easily. Like, and these are the tomatoes that we're eating in June. Like, we're not eating great big heirloom tomatoes in June. We're eating these tasty little cherries, and they are so good, and they will ripen reliably in our climate. So, when in doubt, plant a cherry tomato. You can hardly go wrong with those. Another variety I grow, this is Pink Berkeley Tie-Dye is the name of this variety. But you'll see a lot of, heirloom tomatoes, and there are loads of them, and people get fanatic about their favorite heirloom tomato. I pretty much just grow Pink Berkeley tie-dyes. They work great for us. You'll often see they have kind of this nubbliness underneath. They're sort of wrinkly. That's a kind of a typical heirloom tomato feature. Super great flavor, incredible in that tomato feta salad I mentioned, but very watery. Last but not least, over here we have paste tomatoes. So paste tomatoes are varieties of tomato that have a lot more meat to them, like a lot more wall instead of the juiciness in the middle. So if I cut that tomato and hold it up, you can see like it's pretty dry. If I were doing this with one of those heirloom tomatoes, it would be oozing all over my hand. So I'm doing this with an heirloom tomato, and it's just like full of seeds. You can see how moist it is. It's like dripping tomato juice all over the counter compared to the paste tomato, which is pretty dry. So this makes a big difference if I'm canning or if I'm drying tomatoes. I grow a variety called Amish paste. They're nice and big with this kind of ox heart shape. San Marzano is like the classic, classic tomato, but they have a little bit of a long ripening season for me to grow them here. So I stick with Amish paste, which is an indeterminate tomato. So it just keeps climbing and putting out more fruit, and climbing and putting out more fruit. All things being equal, indeterminate tomatoes, I think, taste a little better than determinate tomatoes. And since I'm growing to please myself, I grow pretty much indeterminate tomatoes that just keep climbing and putting out a bunch. If I were more serious about canning, I might do determinate tomatoes that like give me a bushel of fruit at once. But I can get by with a basket or two, you know, several times a week and do what I need to do for processing tomatoes. Cherry tomatoes, heirloom / slicer tomatoes, paste tomatoes. So those are the 3 tomato categories I grow, and those are the ones that I find most useful in the kitchen. And I'll show you how. Okay. Easiest way to process tomatoes. I want to show a little more of the counter here. Easiest way is to dry them. This is super easy. You can do this lots of different ways, like put them on a cookie sheet in your car, parked in the sunshine, and you will be able to dry tomatoes on a sunny day. And I do this especially for the cherry tomatoes. These little guys, that's a lot of handling time. I want to just be able to kind of process something and handle it easily. I don't want to have to peel this little nugget right here. But if I slice them, and believe me, we slice hundreds of these. We just all sit around on the front porch, slicing tomatoes and lining them up on these drying racks. I have multiple Excalibur brand dehydrators. You can find all kinds of like garage sale dehydrators and the ones that are the stackable rings and stuff. The Excalibur dehydrators have a fan and a heating element, and I just fill the trays like that. And yeah, and then put them into the dehydrator on the hottest setting overnight. And right over here, we've got the Excalibur dehydrator. Okay, so here's what they look like, pulling a Julia Child maneuver and having them all ready. So here are all these little tasty crunchies. And David, could you hand me that jar? So look at this. Like this is so many delicious chilies right here. So all I did was slice them, put them on a dehydrator tray at the highest setting overnight, you know, whatever's gonna get them actually like really dry, no moist pockets that are gonna get moldy. And we store gallons of these and we just throw them into soups and stews. I can pulse these in a blender and make a tasty tomato powder. I didn't peel anything. I didn't take any, you know, stems out, nothing. Slice them, dry them.
Plus, they're harvested at the height of ripeness. So all the lycopenes and the different nutrients in the tomato are preserved in the drying as well.
Yeah, totally. It's one of the easiest, best ways. Like if I had to choose one food preservation method, drying, because it's safe, it's simple, it's easy, hardly takes any space to store. Like each pound of tomatoes will dry down into like an ounce of actual stuff that I have to store. So super handy. This is a little less appetizing looking right off the bat, but this is a tomato sauce. I was making tomato sauce to can in front of you all today, and I came into the kitchen this morning and I had burned it. So this is the stuff that was on top, and I just smeared it onto this dehydrator tray with this little plastic sheet, and I now have dried tomato paste that I can, again, throw into a soup, throw into the crock pot, you know, piece of cake. You can pretty much, like whatever your creativity inspires you to, it will probably turn out okay with tomatoes. That's really, really nice about them. So dehydrating, highly recommended. We sometimes just run the dehydrator in our house when we need the extra heat. I'm really conscious of how we're using energy on the farm, and is there, you know, if there are ways for us to use the extra heat from a dehydrator, we'll have the dehydrator function as a space heater if we need it. So it's really fun for me to think about the pathways of energy through our farm and how to make the most of them. So dehydrating. You could also take paste tomatoes and slice them and dry them. The slicer tomatoes are just too moist. They'll usually just kind of ooze all over the place. And you'll be running the dehydrator a long time to evaporate out all that extra water. So if you're gonna dry, I would say most cherry tomatoes and paste tomatoes are the best bet, unless you have a super cheap dehydrator like your car parked in the sunshine and you can, you know, afford the extra sunlight for doing that. Any questions on dehydrating?
Well, as we wait, maybe pause to see if anyone comes up with any questions. I have a question.
Yeah.
Wondering, do you think I could get something of similar quality if I was to use my oven or convection oven to dry? Or at that point, I'm basically just...
Totally possible. A lot of ovens don't go quite cool enough or have quite the same, you know, like enough air circulation. You kind of get hot spots that are really hot, spots that are really cool. It is totally worth a try. Like, give it a go and experiment with it. And if you're like, I have this basket of tomatoes right here and now, like, let's go. I'll sometimes just cook tomatoes in the oven, you know, like at 200 degrees overnight to make a tomato sauce. And you can totally try drying. It really varies on the oven and on the tomatoes. I also like to dehydrate tomatoes not on metal, because the tomatoes are acidic enough that they'll corrode the metal. So that's something else to think about. Or, you know, they'll corrode the metal, or then I'll get, like if I'm putting them on an aluminum cookie sheet, I don't want aluminum ooze all over my food. So that would be something to keep in mind. Just what surface are you using on your tomatoes? Yeah, does that help?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's super helpful. That's brilliant.
Okay.
This has been
Great. All right, okay.
Another thing I want to suggest is, you don't have to turn it to me. If you don't have this many tomatoes, but you want dried tomatoes, go to your local farmer's market or like the 21 Acres Market and buy a bunch of cherry tomatoes from a local grower, because they have so many tomatoes and they're not able to process them and they need help storing them in your house. So go to a local farmer's market and buy a bunch of those tomatoes while they're ripe, because they don't last.
Thank you.
Local plug.
Yes.
So awesome. We are definitely bustling with tomatoes and a lot of fruit right now at our market, and I'm sure for everyone who's joining, they've got a great local farmer who would love for you to have their tomatoes.
Yeah, sounds good. At this point, I don't know if it would be helpful, Daniel, for you to take the camera and be able to zoom in a little more, switch the lens and zoom in on some of the canning stuff, because folks, this is where it gets mad scientist here. So I'm going to grab my board. Daniel can swap the camera around and you'll be able to zoom in a little closer on some of the process. Okay, let's see. Can you pop it out of the tripod? Oh, okay. Here we go. Great. Okay. That working out on that end?
Yep.
Here is my visual aid. What happens in a canning jar? And I just want to show you that this is going to be a finished product. There are lots of ways to get to canned tomatoes. Canned tomatoes are kind of the classic. For sure, it's the way that's easiest to eat. Like, we can just open up a can, pour it in the crock pot, pour it over the roasted zucchini, and we will eat a lot of canned tomatoes. Oh, David, could you hold this up for a moment? Thank you. I'm so glad I have all this awesome help. So there are lots of different tomato products too that you can. And there are ways to do it safely and there are ways to do it not so safely. Definitely having a tidy kitchen is super helpful for a variety of reasons. And I can't give you like the full canning primer, but I at least want to show you a few things and show you how I prep tomatoes for canning. Because look at this, like this is just this glorious jar of rich, glistening tomato sauce. Here is this firm, beautiful tomato puree. Like these are gonna get us through the winter. And then these are tomatoes I just canned. They're still warm, and these are just raw tomatoes. And you can see that I used here cherry tomatoes and slicing tomatoes. You see how much water there is in there? This was just canning raw tomatoes. I have a lot of water. Whereas this, where you don't have all that water underneath, I boiled the sauce down or simmered the sauce down until it was about half of its volume to get a really thick, yummy tomato paste. Again, you are doing this to please yourself. So if you don't mind, having tomatoes with some water in them, no problem. This is a lot faster. For making the tomato sauce, I've got to be stirring a pot for a while and keeping tabs on it. And as I told you, I even burned a pot of sauce this morning trying to make one to show you. So canning is a pretty simple process ultimately, but it's only been around, let's see, canning jars were patented in 1858. So it's like less than 200 years old, whereas drying has been around forever. So canning's new, but it's been worthwhile for us. And here's what's happening in my life-size canning jars. You fill a jar with...
Slide it over into the light.
Oh, like that?
Mm-hmm.
I love this. This is analog meets digital here, folks. Here's my canning jar. Got this yummy red tomato sauce. It's got these blue water molecules floating around in the air. And it's got these orange oxygen molecules floating around in the air. I fill my jar with tomatoes. I put the lid on. There's oxygen in that jar. That's going to cause spoilage. I take my jar of tomatoes. I put it in boiling water and I boil it and I boil it and I boil it until it's exhausted. You'll see that in canning directions. You're like, exhausted? I'm exhausted. But what's happening is that the water is boiling in that jar, and all that steam, all that water vapor is pushing the oxygen right out of your jar. And then when that jar cools again, all that water vapor cools, condenses, and all of a sudden you have no oxygen in your jar. And you can leave this on your shelf for years because all the pressure of the atmosphere is pushing down on the top of this jar. It's like having enormous giants just working for you in your pantry, holding jar lids on, because this is not held on with any kind of screw. Like no screw lid is on this. It's just atmospheric pressure pushing it down because there's a vacuum in the top of this jar. And it will store like this with minimal loss of nutritional value for years. I try to use mine up every year and like can, fresh batches every year, but it will last for a long time. So this is just like, I just love the science of what's happening in here. This is part of what makes canning a fun science project with kids. So yeah, canning process. Doing this with a high acid food like tomatoes is safe in boiling water. Tomatoes, jams, it's got to be a low pH, like tart. And if that's questionable to you, you can add acid. Check a canning guide when you're doing home canning, just to make sure that you're getting the steps right. But if you can it long enough, if you're boiling it long enough and it's acid food and you're relatively close to sea level, you will have a safe product. And it's a big part of how we feed ourselves through the winter months and eat tomatoes, 10, 11 months out of the year. Great, thank you, David. Okay, so to can tomatoes, there are lots of ways to do it. And as you might have seen, like I just threw into whole cherry tomatoes in a jar. I smooshed them in there. I put a lid on and I put it in my canner. And I canned it for 35 minutes, which is the recommended time to can a pint. And this is a wide mouth pint. Now people say, gosh, canning jars, the hardware store is all out of canning jars. Can't I just use like the jar that I got tomato sauce in? It's got that little vacuum seal lid. And it's one of those like, well, yes. And this is really designed for single use. I have canning jars that have been in use for 50 years, which is older than I am. So like canning jars that just keep getting reused and reused because the glass in a canning jar is designed to take the heat. So track down some canning jars, make use of them. Well, and then people say, what about reusing the lids? I use these happen to be Ball brand lids. And for years, I've reused lids. And they can work. They just don't work as reliably as new lids. If I put 7 jars in a canner, if I'm using new lids, I'm gonna pull 7 sealed jars out. If I use old lids, I'm gonna pull 5 sealed jars out, and the other 2 are not going to be sealed, and I'll have to just eat them or refrigerate them or freeze them or try canning them again with new lids. So just really depends on your time and energy. I don't know if you can really see the difference here. The used lid has a little depression in the rubber around it because that's what kind of sucks down on the edge of the jar. The fresh lid does not have that. So this is just like clean, fresh rubber. And I actually shouldn't even be touching it. The grease from my fingers could cause it to not seal properly on the jar. Because remember, this is sticking onto that jar, into that jar lid, and we want it to be really strong and not have anything in the way.
So canning jars, easy to come up with at a garage sale or at your local thrift store. Just look for that. Can you just hold a canning jar up? Just look for like Kerr or Ball, that certain type of thread look. But for the lids and for the bands, that might be worth buying new.
Yeah, if you
is
can
the
find them,
takeaway.
there's a nationwide shortage, but you only need bands while you're canning. When these jars cool, I take the bands off and I can reuse the bands over and over again. The lids are the only kind of single-ish use part of this. I know there are reusable canning jar systems out there, so I just haven't experimented with them. Some people love them. I just don't know enough about them, but worth a look if you really get into canning. Okay, so where's that blender? David, could you grab me the blender, please, over there? Love this. So what to do with a tomato. Here's my beautiful paste tomato. It's ready for its next adventure. I could do a few things. If I want tomato puree, and I don't want to fuss around with peeling a bunch of tomatoes, I could just load this blender full of tomatoes of any kind, just let it blend on high for a few minutes, and I will wind up with what looks like a strawberry daiquiri, and then I can cook that down, or I'll grab my jar over here. Look at this. I just put it right into a jar, and I just canned tomato puree, basically. Now you can see it's really watery. There's all that water at the bottom, but I bet you this is going to be good in a crock pot. So if you don't want to fuss with peeling tomatoes, you can do that. I personally prefer the flavor of peeled tomatoes and the texture. I've tried canning tomatoes with the peels on, whole tomatoes. I don't love it. It saves time, but I don't love it. And I'm in this because I'm doing what I love and what I love to eat. Usually, I peel tomatoes. Here's the easy way. Hot water is on the stove. It's pretty darn hot. because I want it to be able to handle a bunch of tomatoes going in. So here's our hot water, nice and steamy. I'm filling it up with tomatoes relatively swiftly. Okay, they're all underwater. Just douse them in there, and their skins are going to start to crack and peel. That's what I'm looking for. I don't actually want to cook these tomatoes yet. I just want their skins to crack. The riper they are, the faster those skins will crack, and some varieties will crack and peel easier than others. Again, heirloom tomatoes tend to be a little trickier on this front. So, okay. And then I've got to pull them out, and you might be able to see how that skin is cracking there, and then I can just peel that skin off. Awesome. So they're probably all hot enough. Some people dunk them in cold water. I'm kind of like, well, I seem to do fine without that extra step. And for a lot of my homesteading adventures, I'm not asking, what else can I do? I'm asking, what can I do without? What do I not have to do? Now I've got a bunch of tomatoes. I take off the skins. If they're heirloom tomatoes, they're likely to have a tough stem that I kind of have to dig out with my fingers. But this is a very satisfying tactile experience. So that's okay. And the heirloom tomatoes do taste fabulous. We'll also have, it's a little hard to get all that skin out from all the wrinkles of the heirloom tomatoes. But again, oh well, I'm just gonna call it fun and enjoy it. It's a little less fun if you're doing like 100 pounds of heirloom tomatoes. But here we go. They also have, yes, more woody stem bits that I have to extract. It's fine with me if a little bit of stem winds up, or a little bit of skin winds up still in here. We'll live. Now these I give to our chickens usually. You can also dehydrate these and like make a flavor powder, use them to color stuff. But most days I just give them to the chickens. So you'll notice if I peel one of our paste tomatoes here, the skin and the stem typically come off even easier than the heirloom tomatoes did. And there's not that like thick woody core. There's a little bit of green where the stem was, but I don't need to dig out a core. Like the paste tomatoes have been bred for this. This is their destiny, to be tomato sauce. So you can see everything's really easy to peel. They're not too hot. I just yank off some of the skins. And at this point, I could peel more. I could fill this whole pan and then cook that down, maybe overnight, gently, until it's about reduced by about half. That usually seems to be a good balance for me. That takes a lot of tomatoes. Any questions on this process so far?
We'll pause for some questions. We were sharing a couple sentiments in the chat. Many of us are, I am drooling. This looks amazing. This is a really beautiful site. And Becca shared she's really wanting to get into the kitchen right now.
Yeah, great. I'm so glad it's having that effect.
And you know, it's really great to have the whole synthesis of you growing these tomatoes from seed, having, you know, this beautiful plan, and then also knowing we can jump in and do this if we are supporting our local farmers as well. We could, I could go to the farmer's market and try to do what you're doing. My tomatoes, we shared my tomatoes. I actually have the blossom end rot. So I just looked up a couple days ago that calcium trick. Yeah, the eggshells. I'm gonna have to do better next year. Some animals.
Yeah, they will. They'll grow for you. Cool.
There's any
Alexia,
other
this is Becca. We had a question in the chat about the 21 acres dry farm tomatoes. and we're kind of talking about that. I was wondering if you guys had any experience with dry farm tomatoes or different ways of growing tomatoes.
Yes. So I space my tomato plants between 2 and 4 or 5 feet apart because I have my cherry tomatoes and some of my heirlooms are right up close to the house where I can fuss over them and water them a little more. And they're close to our rain barrels. And then I have hoop houses way out in the field where I plant the tomatoes and maybe they might get watered once or twice in a season and that's it. So, and just whatever they produce is kind of great extra, extra for us. They definitely give bigger tomatoes when we water them. But like I said, the plants will do their best for us. So that's been my experience, just planting the tomatoes farther apart and cultivating so that there aren't other weeds competing for moisture. And then I kind of let them fend for themselves for my more dry farmed tomatoes. Yeah, I want to make sure that we have cherry tomatoes or there would be a mutiny in the household. So that's why I focus on babying the cherry tomato plants, but a lot of the others fend for themselves. And then whatever we get is like an awesome bonus. Does that help?
Awesome, thank you, yeah.
So coming back to our gorgeous tomatoes right here, we've got our heirloom tomatoes, which are delicious, they're just quite watery. We've got our paste tomatoes, which are good and meaty, like this is a dense fruit here. So I can do a couple of things. I could peel a bunch more, turn this into a tasty sauce and can that. But since my sauce burned, I'm just gonna stuff a jar to show you that process of putting a jar, getting a jar ready for canning. So you can use a canning funnel. I really love having a canning funnel. If I'm using whole tomatoes, it doesn't feel as pertinent. But I have a clean, warm jar here. Nothing grungy that's gonna interfere with the lid. And I'll squish them in. I'm trying to get all the air out. And I could even come with a knife and poke air bubbles there if I wanted. Okay. So I have it filled up to about a 1/2 inch of the rim. Usually have a dish towel around. I wore my red sweater and I have my red dish towel to minimize tomato stains. This is a super clean dish towel. So I'm just wiping off any tomato gunk from the threads and from the rim. Because remember, I want my giants to be able to push down on this lid all day long. So I want to make sure that that's clean. Here's my rubber jar. It just came out of warm water. And so it's clean. And I'm going to put that lid on. I'm going to put my band on. And I'm not going to crank this as tight as I can. And I'm not going to leave it just like loosey-goosey flopping around. I'm going to have it finger tight. Because I don't want water to get in. I want that steam to be able to come out as the pressure increases in this jar. I also don't want to take my cold jars and fill them up with something hot, or take hot jars and put them into cold water. Minimize thermal shock. So this is filled with cool tomatoes at this point. But what I can do is come over to open the submarine hatch on my canner. Now this is a pressure cooker, but I'm not using it for pressure canning or pressure cooking. I'm using it for water bath canning. I have warm water in here, which I know from the morning's experience will cover these jars if I fill them up. I have these handy tongs. Oh my gosh, if there's one canning tool that you get, have a pair of these on hand. So useful, keeps you from trying to fish stuff out of boiling hot water. So in goes my jar. For the sake of argument, for demonstration, I'm going to be putting my other jars back in here. So all the jars are stable and sturdy in there. Look, I even canned some blackberry sauce. And if I put all the jars back in, this hot water will cover the tops of the jars. Because remember, air needs to come out, but not come back in. If I fill this up, I turn up the heat, and then I will let this boil, let it come to a boil, and I will let it boil for the recommended time for whatever jar size I'm using. And that's something you would need to look up based on your jars. For pints like this, 35 minutes from when it comes to a boil to when it's done. So once it's done, I just take my jars right out of the hot water. I let them sit on a dish towel until they're dry, and I make sure that they've sealed. Remember our little commercial jar and that familiar click? You've probably heard that before. All these jars, actually not all of them, what I want to feel is a very firm top. So these all feel firm. My blackberry juice, uh-oh, that did not seal properly. Now I can let it sit for another 12 hours and maybe it will seal. If it doesn't seal, I can't go put this in my pantry. There's oxygen inside and it's going to spoil, and I'm going to show up one day and have just a jar of mold that's going to be oozing all over the place. So I want to make sure that I'm only storing sealed jars. And if they boil for the right amount of time so that they're exhausted, they should seal properly. I make a point of writing on the top what everything is. Usually it's Tom 2020. Good shorthand for that. So that is just a little bit of the canning equipment I use and what it looks like. And let's just take a quick peek in the pantry for how we store all this bounty. Sound good?
That sounds great. As we walk over, we got a question from Gloria. Gloria grew pink Berkeley tie-dyes for the first time this year. They were very juicy, but noticed that their texture is a bit on the mushy side. Wondering if that's normal.
It has been for me, or at least they haven't always been, you know, that's part of the feature. I don't know what might influence it. A lot of things influence fruits, like how much phosphorus or potassium you have in your soil, but I don't have enough of an agronomy background to be able to say it's one thing or the other the way I can with calcium and blossom end rot. So yeah.
Try picking them a day or two earlier than you think they need to be picked. Let them sit and ripen for a day and then just see if that makes any difference.
Yeah.
Thank you guys, that's awesome. And
So
thank you,
this is the pantry, and this is of Daniel's design and organization. And I am so grateful for his tidiness because it makes it so much easier. He was able to build furniture. And again, even if you're not building furniture, just thinking about how to store things. So all these bins here in this central table, he designed to fit canning jars. And so here are all my tomatoes. All my tomato sauce is in here. And I can easily come through and just make sure that all those jars are still sealed. Oh my gosh, here are all the peaches. Everything's looking good. Whoa, applesauce, apple butter. Ugh. And then as we empty jars, we can store jars in the back side of these same bins. So we're not needing double storage. Although you see over there, we have a whole range of our canning jars of different sizes. We have the lids, we have the bands, and this is what keeps our home pantry rocking along. And we've got bins for the dried fruit, dried teas, dried basil. Over here are jars of dried veggies, buckets of dried fruit. So it's just a really nice feeling to go into the fall with a bunch of pantry staples, knowing that we're going to coast on this bounty. Like this year's sunlight is feeding us as we coast towards next fall. So at this point, I feel like, whew, we probably are going to survive the winter with what we've got, and the corn and the squash that we have yet to harvest. And to be able to make a beautiful vat of polenta in the wintertime and just pour rich, luscious tomato sauce all over it on a cold winter's day, that really makes the homesteading life worthwhile and makes it a lot of fun to do these great, delicious science experiments. So I know we're getting close to time, but any questions on the pantry scene here?
You did a great job organizing and making it, easy to access, and sincerely not only, like survive, but thrive. It's just so beautiful to see your journey and how it's turned into, something so life-sustaining and fulfilling. I'm so inspired right now.
Yay! Well, it takes a lot of help. We have so many hands and hearts and rootlets. I'm looking at our farm helper, David, who's just like been slicing tomatoes all the time. So even though I'm the one talking, I'm really not the one who can take the credit for the beauty here. I'm just part of the ecology, and it's such a delight to share. Yeah.
That's a beautiful message. It does take, community. We're here with and for and by each other, and just really fills my heart up.
Yay. Yeah. So I encourage the creativity of all of you and the relationship with the tomato plants, whether or not you're growing them. I'm so grateful for how many people they have fed all around the world and through the ages, and just really grateful for people who continue that relationship. And every time you eat a tomato, you're a part of that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to share a message from Betsy, who's been just so fun it's been great to read your messages in the chat. Betsy says, absolutely spectacular pantry. You are so inspiring. Thanks so much, Alexia. Thanks everyone for this really informative workshop.
Yay. Sounds great. Oh, Daniel is getting ready.
I want to put in a little plug for coming back in a month to fill up a crock like so with homegrown cabbage. So in a month, we're going to share about growing cabbages and carrots and onions and beets, and how to preserve them in a salt brine ferment next month. So come back for fermenting. Yes, because vitamin C does not survive canning or drying. So you need the sauerkraut also to get your vitamin C in the winter. So, yeah.
Cannot wait for next month. This month was so fantastic. Thank you so much, Daniel, for reminding me. I was going to say, join us next month, but now, oh my gosh, can we just have a time travel machine? Get there. Becca says, thank you so much, Alexia and Daniel. So much practical knowledge that she can't wait to put to work.
Great.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage wellness and health for everybody and your families with so many struggles all around this country and all around the world. May people be safe and healthy and happy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Same to you. And well, wonderful workshop from Gloria. Really appreciated your kind offering. Stay safe, everybody. I feel like that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much again for your amazing journey and sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you, and everyone at 21 Acres. We'll see you next month.
Of course. Thanks all for joining. Bye.
Bye.